You're listening to the Safe Tea podcast, hosted by Nicky Brownjohn, where we talk all things safeguarding over a cup of tea.
Welcome to the Safe Tea podcast. I'm Nicky Brownjohn and I'm the independent chair for the Brent Safeguarding Adults Board. With me today is Duc. So Duc, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, Nicky. My name is Duc Tran. I am currently in Brent as the Adult Social Care Transformation Program Manager. I have been leading on the co-production and community partnership enabling program for the past several years. So community engagement is very important to us. Also, in my previous career, I've been team manager and area manager for various local authorities, working on adult safeguarding inquiries, and have been supporting teams and practitioners and inquiry officers as well.
Thank you. Thank you. So today we are talking about community engagement as a safeguarding tool. So just to start off, around considering community engagement as something to do for prevention of harm, how can people with lived experience of abuse, neglect or services help shape better safeguarding responses?
I think people with lived experience can really bring insight into what makes services feel safer for themselves. Services can be more respectful and accessible. Often we design services without consideration to the lived experience of people. And then their experience of neglect and abuse or being ignored can be exacerbated even further when they feel that they're not supported in a safe and respectful way. And I think it's very important, therefore, when we do look at how services are run, not just safeguarding services, but services generally, that we include wherever we can the voice of lived experience to ensure that what we do is what we are co-producing or co-designing is in the right direction and that it actually does meet people's needs. Otherwise, I think we would then lose people and deliver services for the sake of delivering services, but lacking the impact and the improvement that we need.
Thank you. That really sounds sensible and really having that lived experience of seeping through everything that we do and all the services. So we're not expecting them to fit in a box. We should be providing flexible services for them. So how can strong community relationships prevent safeguarding concerns before they escalate?
I think developing relationships in a community are ever so important. It is really about developing that trust for disclosure to occur, for people to be candid about their experiences, for people to really say how it feels, not say what you want them to say, or make them say the things that they think you want them to say. Genuine relationships are strong relationships based on trust. And it is so ever important that we do engage with communities in a way that shows that we are honest about where we are, and that we're genuine in our approach to really develop services that are based on much more genuine relationships.
And I think that takes us into thinking about how we build trust within that participation. So you've spoken about communities and gaining that trust there, that can really help prevent and safeguarding and concerns. But something that we hear about a lot, not just in Brent, but sort of else across the country, is around people who are term I do not like using, but people aren't engaging with us or they're hard to reach. So I always sort of try to turn that around into what have we done to try and work with it. So just wondered if you could think about any effective ways to involve people who might seem to be hesitant, fearful, or just not wanting to be involved with services.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And something that I've seen often, actually, we term people as difficult to engage or challenging, when in fact it's the approach that we need to look at. It's not an easy question to answer. But what I would say is that people feel that they've got a part in the relationship, or that they feel that they can engage with you or with our services when they feel safe, when they feel that they've been listened to, when they feel also that they've been understood. And I think those are the very fundamentals that we need to establish first. Before we start that intention of developing services or getting them into a meeting or getting them into an event to work with us, I think there are certain things that we need to establish first. And that is really the ability to engage by listening without judgment, to appreciate where people are from. And it can take a while for some people because of all the experiences that they've had to go through. So if they've experienced neglect, that's how they would behave, potentially. So for us to reach out to people, we need to sit by them and start listening to them rather than say that they're hard to engage, because it may be that they need a bit of time to get used to us. That it may be that they haven't had that opportunity or a person that has shown that they are willing to listen. And so I think that there are fundamental things about that we need to factor in, and we need to be with people where they're at. There may be also in their experiences of potential abuse where they're unable to engage because of the trauma, because of that history with services. So we need to be mindful that not everyone is at the same stage in that journey of engagement. And I think it's really important for practitioners and services generally to be curious, but also be sensitive to where people are at and where families are at. The worst thing that we can do is to rush in, to think that we've got all the answers, when in fact we don't. We think we do, but our individuals, our residents and communities need to also find their own answers. They need to be confident that they have an answer that can meet their own interests and needs. And we need to work with them to develop that. And that's something that I'm very keen that we do through co-production and community partnership work.
And so really sort of looking from an individual perspective, we need to develop that real relational sort of work, really giving them time, having services that will allow practitioners to take that time. It might not be just a one visit or one call. It might take quite a while. But it's very much about working with individuals rather than doing to them. And so then that brings us back to that community engagement and that co-production, doesn't it? If we can get that trust within our communities about what we do, then when an individual needs that support, then there'll be people around to encourage them to work with us a little bit more. But thinking about communities, sort of where can we sort of use spaces within the community? What role do informal spaces like community centres or cafes or sort of the little groups of peers that sort of are around, what role do they play in safeguarding?
Yeah. So these places are vital because they do often present a more comfortable and familiar environment than formal services, than inviting people into the civic centre to have a meeting where you have to go through security, etc. These places where people are very important places. They are places where people exchange messages, where they hear messages, where they ask questions and explore for themselves what works for their neighbour or an acquaintance and what doesn't work. These are the places I feel that we should be in. We should be engaging to explore what works and what doesn't work for people. Because it's these spaces where community comes to life. And unless in services we are also part of that, then we are at risk of alienating ourselves and engaging in activities that are more busy but less impactful. And I do feel very, very strongly that these informal spaces are important. We need to have more of them. We need to engage in them and we need to invest in them. And we need to get out and not be stuck in our ivory towers in meeting rooms or civic centres, etc. We need to be out there in the community and learn what makes our communities tick.
And I absolutely agree, and I think that they're the life and soul, aren't they, of their communities, these places. And last year, when I was doing the community engagement project for the Safeguarding Adults Board, and that was the most important information that I was gaining about what's really going on in the borough, and how people were feeling, and the fears and the questions they had, or the successes that they had with services. And there were different groups, different communities, different spaces, and I found myself allocate an hour to be with them, and I'd want to stay a lot longer, and I'd have to sort of drag myself out. And so I think it was so valuable to me. So I think for practitioners listening to this podcast, and for managers as well, how do you factor in that time for practitioners to get out into the community? Those managers or commissioners who are planning and producing services, how are you getting out there into the community and really getting a sense of who is it that we're providing this service for, and what is it that they want, and how can we work with them in a better way? And obviously, we're in Brent, so we have a very, very diverse community across Brent. And so thinking about specifically around sort of safeguarding, do you have any sort of thoughts about whose voices are often missing in safeguarding, and what risks that creates?
Yes. The voice of older people with limited English, isolated carers, and people who fear stigma because of their background and history are often missing from the conversation around safeguarding. If we do not have opportunities for them to be more visible, and for their voices to be heard, the risk is of abuse and neglect being hidden and being exacerbated further. It's quite interesting that, for me, this really comes out quite clearly when you've got COVID, that the voice of older people are not heard. For instance, we need to be mindful of their interests in the community as well.
So would you give any advice to the practitioners who are trying to reach marginalised groups, those hidden groups in the community? Are there any ways that they could reach them in a better way?
Sure. Yes, I think having that cultural knowledge is important. And if you have the ability to speak a particular language is important, because language frames people's perceptions of the world, including how they perceive risks and protective measures. Language is also the key to how you engage as well, because some language structures determine your status in the family, etc., and levels of authority. And safeguarding is about power, imbalance of power. So when you speak to a young person who's at risk of neglect or abuse from a particular community that has a hierarchy in their culture and extreme respect for elderly people, parents who potentially could be neglecting them or abusing them, then that would then become an issue, obviously. Similarly, in families where there is a reverence for particular family members who themselves are engaging in abusive, exploitative behaviors, then that would be a problem, I suppose, a bigger problem for the victim who you're supporting, overcome, and to find the courage to make a move away, or to find the courage to challenge that. So we need to be mindful of linguistic and cultural factors that affect the people that we are serving, that we are supporting. But if we do not have those kinds of cultural knowledge and expertise, that's okay. What we do need is to make sure that we have the cultural humility to start at a place of learning and professional curiosity. And if we strive towards developing that genuine conversation, honest conversation with people, then it will come across. Over time, we get to know the person and they get to know us. And I think that's where relational approaches are so important. Each community is different. So I suppose we're quite blessed in Brent that we've got quite a diverse community. But that is also the challenge for our services and our workers, is to be able to understand where people are at and in what cultural and linguistic contexts they come from, and to be prepared to engage in a way that is more relational, that then can develop the trust for people to disclose and for people to make the changes that they need to, or that they want to, in order to overcome the abuse and and the neglect and exploitation that they may be experiencing.
Thank you. That really put me in mind one of the visits that I made last year, thinking about that cultural humility. I think that's a real takeaway point, I think, for this podcast today, is that, I'm a white, older woman and British, and I went into this group of women where we needed an interpreter to sort of get through. They were wary about what I was going to be talking about. I was there to talk about safeguarding adults. We ended up talking safeguarding children. That's what they wanted to talk about. But we ended up, even though we all came from very different backgrounds, very different, cultural, origins and language differences. We were sitting there laughing. We could have that real connection. And so I hope that did something for practitioners out there to be able to, sort of to connect with these communities. And it certainly did for me. That actually they were starting to trust me, and I put them in touch with sort of the some children's workers. That's the thing. So we were able to develop that trusting relationship. Going back into the communities, what role do neighbours and faith groups and those local networks have in identifying risks? And is there anything in your work that you think that can promote that trust?
Yes, definitely. I think we need to recognise that people who are based in the community, our faith groups, local assets, community assets, leaders and networks are the people who could and who can and who will notice any changes first, who can notice changes in people's behavior, in people's routines, etc., whether that's their neighbors taking out the bin or not, whether they're going up to their luncheon club or not, etc., then they can be the eyes and ears for us in terms of identifying potential risks and issues that may arise. So starting from that, it's really important that we think about how we support our partners in identifying patterns potentially of abuse and patterns of neglect and exploitation. But they also need the right information, and we need to provide that information in an accessible format so that they know who to contact for help and advice. It staggers me that we still produce a lot of information in English, and yet even the top 5 most spoken languages in Brent, we don't have sufficient information for. Even in the top 2, we don't have sufficient information for. So the challenge that we have, and the challenge I think for other councils, not just Brent as well, is that we need to work more closely with our communities in a way that provides information that is accessible and relevant and something that they can rely on as a partner. So we can't just simply say that they're great assets and we can use them, but we also need to come to the table with real, tangible information that is accessible, that's relevant, and contact details and services that will, that can address their interest and their needs. So we need to be able to respond to our communities in that way. And unfortunately, over time, if we don't show that we have this interest and we don't show that we're producing the products and services that communities can engage with, then we would lose them. And unfortunately, we would lose the vital eyes and ears that make safeguarding in the community work.
Yes, and in society now, because we're not all going to the shops, are we? People shop online. There aren't always people going out into the community. There's a lot more isolation now. So it is really important, the value that we place on local communities to be our eyes and ears and to be looking after each other, because then that way there's a real effort in preventing safeguarding issues and any harm. Just to end with, is there anything that you want to tell us about the framework for evaluating change that you've been working on and how that impacts on the community engagement and co-production work?
Thank you for raising that, Nicola. Yes, I'm delighted to say that we have in the co-production and community partnership enabling program within Adult Social Care in Brent, co-produced residents, customers and carers, a framework to evaluate the effectiveness of our services. We are taking a much more radical approach in evaluating change. In that, the framework for evaluating change actually embeds stories of change and the principles of co-production to explain how we've changed by involving people with lived experience. So if you think of the theory of change, for instance, it's rather static. It doesn't convey necessarily what that story of change is. It just says, well, we're here at the moment and we want to be there in 6 months' time. And in 6 months' time, we would have the outputs for that to show that we've improved in these metrics. The framework for evaluating change is actually about people sharing their stories of what works and what doesn't work with them. It's about services that are supporting them also having the opportunity to share their experiences of what works and what hasn't worked for these families, and to learn from the individual stories and the family stories, to think about how better to organize services to reduce silo working and duplication, to invest and target resources in a much more meaningful and effective way. There's also that neighborhood story as well in the framework. And it's so important to recognize that their lives aren't just defined by the services that engage with them, but by the neighborhood that they're in, by the different assets that's available in the community and the things that they're interested in. So understanding what their neighborhood looks like for that individual that we're supporting or that family we're supporting is also key to helping us better develop services that would actually complement their existing interests, strengths, and assets. So that's the neighborhood story that we also need to develop and understand. And the other elements of the framework for evaluating change includes learning from these stories and triangulating that with the data that we have around individuals, whether that's through case notes or different types of interventions that have been successful or not. It's also about triangulating the service data that we hold on individuals and whether, that has improved or whether they respond better to other services. It doesn't have to be ours. And in fact, it may be that they respond better to neighborhood interventions, not statutory or council-led interventions. So triangulating all those levels together to have a better understanding of that picture around that individual, the person and their family, helps us then to think about how we would change in a way that includes these voices. So the voice in the stories that they tell us from individuals, the voice in the stories that the service staff, the professionals tell us, and the voices within the stories of our neighborhoods. That is really important. And through that kind of process, we are actually documenting change. We're not saying that this has changed. We're actually saying how we've changed. And so that is so powerful because that then shows us a way forward, and potentially that way forward can help us to make the changes that we need to make in our services and in the way that we deliver services. And the other thing is that it's a iterative cycle of change. It doesn't stop there. So once we've made the changes that we said we would make, let's go back in 6 months' time or a year's time, or whenever that is, that's agreed, and ask those stories again. With the changes that we've made, has that helped the individual? What is their story of that change? Has that helped that family? And we go through that process again. And through the iterative process, we would hopefully refine the way that we approach individuals and families in the delivery of services so that it becomes much more impactful.
Thank you. I think that really sums up what we've been talking about, really, about working with individuals and not doing to them, not saying that they're reluctant to engage, but actually recognising what their story is and why they might be not wanting a service, and being able to continue to try to work with them and then find that change, I think is a really powerful narrative. And then secondly, around working with neighbourhoods, that we'll feel that we're getting out there and actually being with with them, with the communities, rather than in our ivory towers. And then thirdly, I also talk about safeguarding and continually improving. So I think this framework really helps us with that. It's a continual process that we need to adapt to what's going on in the world, but also about what's happening, what the story, how the narrative is changing for those individuals in those communities. So I think that's a really wonderful place just to stop. So thank you so much for talking to me today. And thank you, and look forward to hearing more about the framework at the Safeguarding Adults Board in the future. Thank you very much.